Hello, BookTube, and welcome to DuneTube 2019. I'm doing this as a collective event with a couple of other great booktubers where we read one of Frank Herbert's Dune novels every month from July until December and go over them. And my colleagues are all doing theirs in the normal read along way with one video a month summarizing their thoughts on each book. But by special dispensation, they have allowed me to do a normal read along. We're doing actual read alongs of each of these books. We started with Dune, which is, of course, one of the greatest science fiction novels of all time. We went on to Dune Messiah, which has long been misunderstood and denigrated by Dune fans, and we got a lot of good out of rereading that. And now we're reading Children of Dune, the third book in the series, and this is the new Ace paperbacks that I got by random chance. I got these by random chance shortly before we decided to do DuneTube 2019, and this is the story of the children of the main character in Dune. In Dune, young Paul Atreides and his family are sent to the planet Dune, the planet Arrakis, which is the only source of the spice melange, which is deeply addictive, but gives certain recipients extraordinary powers. It can prolong life. It increases your immunity to disease. It changes your eyes to blue on blue. But it also, in some people, increases, for instance, the religious order of the Bene Gesserit. It can increase their mental and physical powers. It heightens their ability to detect falsehood and to achieve a kind of spice trance that gives them control over their bodies in a way that most people don't have. And it heightens the prescience, the ability to foresee lines in the future of the guild navigators, the spacing guild, which allows interplanetary travel with faster than light drive, where otherwise every planet, as we're told in this book, every planet would be its own world, and they wouldn't be connected to anyone else because the travel between worlds would take too long. And it does one other thing. It does one other thing. In certain highly contrived genetic circumstances, it can produce uh, individuals who are in complete connection with all the memories of all of their ancestors going back to the beginning of time. The Bene Gesserit have often inculcated that ability in their Reverend Mothers, but only on the female side. And they have long been coercing breeding lines among the noble houses to produce the Kwisatz Haderach, a male figure with the powers of a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother. Uh, and they get that in Paul Atreides. They get that in Paul Muad'Dib, the main character from Dune, and the main character in Dune Messiah, who uses his abilities to unseat the Emperor in this grand imperium, the man who originally assigned his family to Dune and to their destruction, and become Emperor himself. And that's the triumphant note that Dune ends on. And then Dune Messiah is a decided counternote. Dune Messiah is about the corruption of power, about the cynicism of power, about the world weariness that has crept into Paul Atreides uh, as he's grown older and learned the trap of leadership. And as he has started to foresee, with his own prescience is enormous. It's far greater than anyone else's in the universe. And he started to foresee dark portents of humanity's future, and that has started to worry him. He started to wonder what the end result of this enormous jihad that his warriors, the desert people, the Fremen, have unleashed on the galaxy. He started to wonder what the end result of that will be, and whether or not humanity will survive it. And as Children of Dune starts, his children, Leto and Ganima, are 9 or 10. They're little kids, but only physically. That kind of vast personal ancestral awareness that happens to Reverend Mothers, for instance, when they undergo the spice agony, that happened to Paul Atreides when he underwent the spice agony, that is true of his children from their birth. It's also true of Paul's sister Alia from birth. She is the regent. She's older now, and is running the empire until the children come of age. Uh, and one of the warnings that the Bene Gesserit has always given about that preborn people suddenly gaining access to thousands of adult memories. One of the problems there that the Bene Gesserit has always warned about is something they call abomination. That those memories, who are still, in Frank Herbert's conception, those memories are still people. They're still alive. And they want a physical body to experience the world again. Basically ghosts. And there's a temptation to consult with them and gain all sorts of knowledge advantage over all the people around you who think you are just one person. But there's also a danger that they will take control of you, and you will become essentially possessed by an ancestral spirit and become an abomination. And it becomes clear at the beginning of this book that Leto and Ghanima are aware of the fact that Alia has succumbed and is the kind of abomination that the Sisterhood worried about. And that maybe that's partially the reason why Paul's mother, the Lady Jessica, returns to Dune after being gone for a long time, to set up a kind of rival power play, not just to expose Alia, but also to take control of the children. Because the Leto and Ghanima are worried that if they undergo the spice agony, they also will succumb to abomination. They know perfectly well that they have throngs of memories inside themselves, far more than anyone else. They are awed even by Alia's standards. And in the meantime, while all of this palace intrigue is going on, a strange figure has returned to the palace city, called the Preacher. And the last we saw of Paul Atreides, he is blind and he wanders into the desert because the Fremen don't keep the blind. They don't keep non-productive members of society. Instead, they're expected to walk out into the desert and die. And Paul Atreides does that at the end of Dune Messiah. But in Children of Dune, a figure has returned. It's pretty clearly Paul. He is called the Preacher, and he is speaking heretical denunciation of Alia and of this religious jihad that she is now leading in Paul Muad'Dib's name. And in the chapters that we've seen up until now, we're handling this read along a little differently right at this point. Not just because the Dune books are unhelpfully unnumbered. The chapters are unnumbered, which means you're at the mercy of whatever different edition that you have if we go by page number to block out the reading. But also because I didn't think there was any point. I want to talk about the end, the last 150, 170, 200 pages of this book for a couple of weeks. I want to finish up the discussion with those pages. So I figured last week I said we should just read to the end of this book, and then we'll just talk about it. We'll talk about the whole of the ending. So we'll talk about a little of that today, and then we'll continue it next week. I don't want to make these read-along videos too long, because I did a video earlier today that went on to a hideous length. So the key fact to take into account in the chapters that we're reading today is that a daughter of the old deposed emperor concocted a plot to kill Leto and Ghanima using tigers in the desert, and appears to have succeeded in killing Leto. Ghanima is saved, but she is sure, in fact, her memory holds up to the investigation of Imperial truthsayers, that Leto is dead. She's sure of that the plot succeeded and that they succeeded in killing him. And the machinations between Lady Jessica and Ghanima's proposed husband and Alia proceed apace, while the narrative splits to show us that Leto is not dead, that he and Ghanima contrived a kind of hypnosis for her, that Leto can bring her out of that. But until then, she will believe that he is dead. And we follow Leto through his own adventures. And those adventures have a very different tone to them from the rest of the book. They are high adventure, but in a very inward way. I'm wondering what all the rest of you make of it. It's page after page after page of Leto exploring the phenomenon that is unfolding inside him. Because it turns out he is captured by a renegade people among the Fremen, a hated outcast group among the Fremen, who are working partially in conjunction with emissaries of Lady Jessica to force Leto into a kind of, first of all, into a kind of spice agony. He is over fused with spice. He's given vast amounts of it. It's only his Bene Gesserit trained ability over his own body that stops him from overdosing. And he has to maintain that vigilantly, but he's very weak. He can't actually escape. They just continually load him and load him and load him with spice. In an effort to coerce his will, in an effort to get him to agree to the Bene Gesserit plan to marry his own sister, and also in an effort to decide once and for all whether or not abomination is a threat in him. And in the pages that we saw last time, Leto has a kind of very, very internal breakthrough. There's no moment like the sandworms breaking through the shield wall at the end of Dune. Instead, this is all very internal, where Leto realizes that he can strike a bargain that will allow him to be a master over the ancestral voices that are clamoring inside him. And it brings him to a place of awareness that is far, far beyond the awareness of the people around him, his erstwhile captors. It brings him to a place of internal awareness, and there's no other way to put it, that makes him not very human, even less human than he was before, even less human than he and Ganima were. They were physically children, but they had access to all of these memories and are constantly telling people, I am the oldest person in this room. Please don't forget that. Everyone still does forget it. But they were still human. They were still siblings who loved each other. And after these internal revelations, Leto doesn't seem that way at all. And his consciousness takes on a kind of blur to it, even after he's escaped from his captors and made his way from, it looks like, from the frying pan to the fire, from one group of renegades to an even worse group of renegades. But at one point, I find Herbert's description of his perceptions to be amazing, just amazing. It's great even at the beginning of the book, and it gets more sharper and more poetic once he has that internal revelation, especially when he realizes, he gets out and about in the desert and realizes that there are all sorts of advanced projects here to build canals of water to greatly accelerate the greening of Arrakis. Leto feels that this is wrong. He feels that this is betrayal of the ancient Fremen world, and also that it would betoken the death of the sandworms that rampage over the deep deserts of Dune, and that Leto knows perfectly well are the source of the spice. And at one point, there's a scene where he's talking with there's a young woman named Sabia who was responsible for letting him get away from his original captors, and they've met again, and he's talking with this new group of Fremen, and he notices something. He's standing by one of the canal engines, and he says, Leto turned then and followed Sabia. He found her standing at the edge of the canal. Leto moved up beside her and looked down at the water. There were birds in the nearby fan palms, and he heard their calls, their wings. The workers made scraping sounds as they moved sand. Still, he did as Sabia did, looking down, deep into the water and its reflections. The corner of his eyes saw blue parakeets in the palm fronds. One flew across the canal, and he saw it reflected in a silver swirl of fish, all run together as though the birds and predators swam in the same firmament. Lovely. Just lovely stuff. And one of the side effects of Leto, of this amazing internal breakthrough that he has, is a drastic increase in his own prescience, in his own ability to foresee not only his future, but the future of humanity. He sees what Paul Muad'Dib saw. He sees a much more detailed version of what Paul Muad'Dib saw. That humanity is headed for its own destruction. Not just the destruction of the worms and the spice, but the destruction of everything. And that there's a way to avoid that. Shakur Nabai, the golden path. There's a way to avoid it. And it is a beautiful vision, but it requires a horrifying price from one person, the one person who is willing to bring it about. Paul Muad'Dib saw that price and refused to pay it, was afraid to pay it, just personally afraid to do it. Leto sees that price and decides to do it, partially because of the delirium of his spice-induced fever dream that he's been in for 150 pages, but also for other reasons, because he sees that it's necessary, because he sees that it's that or nothing. And it involves the sandworms. I did a separate video on sandworms and their life cycle. They start out as sand trout, arm-length things vectors of sandworms, that larvae that live in the sand and that band together they sense and encapsulate liquid moisture, and they grow and they grow and they grow, and then they blow. They encapsulate that moisture and gases under the sand and whatnot. That becomes very volatile, and after a time it explodes in a spice blow, which creates the spice, and also is a signal to nearby sand trouts to begin their metamorphosis into sandworms, these giant creatures that roam the sands of Dune. And Fremen children have long had a game involving sand trout, where they pluck them out of the sand and plaster them on their hand, a thin layer on their hand, until the sand trout dry up and you can just peel them off and drop them away. It's a children's game. And the reason why the sand trout dry up and you can peel them off is because it's human flesh that they're attached to, and there's no instinctive interest in them when they're attached to human flesh. But Leto's flesh is not human anymore. It is absolutely saturated with the spice melange, far more so than any human being has ever been before, except perhaps his sister, and even she did not go through what the smugglers had put him through. When Leto attaches sand trouts to his skin, he knows perfectly well they're going to have a different reaction than they do with ordinary Fremen children. He says over and over again, long before it happens, his visions have already told him, my skin is not my own. And I want to read you just a bit. For a moment, he felt the reality of his terrible decision. The sand trout glove. It was the play of children. If one held a sand trout in the hand, smoothing it over your skin, it formed a living glove. Traces of blood in the skin's capillaries could be sensed by the creatures, but something mingled with the blood's water repelled them. Sooner or later, the glove would slip off into the sand, there to be lifted into a spice fiber basket. The spice soothed them until they were dumped into the death still. He could hear sand trout dropping into the canal, the swirl of predators eating them. Water softened the sand trout, made it pliable. Children learned this early. A bit of saliva teased out the sweet syrup inside the sand trout. Leto listened to the splashing. This was a migration of sand trout come up to the open water, but they could not contain the flow of the canal patrolled by predator fish. Still they came, still they splashed. Leto groped on the sand with his right hand until his fingers encountered the leathery skin of a sand trout. It was the large one he had expected. The creature didn't try to evade him, but moved eagerly onto his flesh. He explored its outline with his free hand, roughly diamond-shaped. It had no head, no extremities, no eyes, yet it could find water unerringly. With its fellows, it could join body to body, locking one on another by the coarse interlacings of extruded cilia until the whole became one large sac organism enclosing the water, walling off the poison from the giant which the sand trout would become. The sand trout squirmed on his hand, elongating, stretching. As it moved, it felt a counterpart elongating and stretching he felt a counterpart of the elongating and stretching that he had seen in his vision. He felt the sand trout becoming thin, covering more and more of his hand. No sand trout had ever before encountered a hand such as this one, every cell supersaturated with spice. No other human had ever before lived and reasoned in such a condition. Delicately, Leto adjusted his enzyme balance, drawing on the illuminated sureness he'd gained in spice trance. The knowledge from those uncounted lifetimes which blended together within him provided a certainty through which he chose the precise adjustments, staving off the death from an overdose which would engulf him if he relaxed his watchfulness for even a heartbeat. And at the same time, he blended himself with the sand trout, feeding on it, feeding it, learning it. His trance vision provided the template, and he followed it precisely. What we see in these chapters is Leto accepting his transformation into something that isn't human. Something that can enact the golden path. And that's where I want to end our read-along today. We will still be talking about these final chapters. There's a lot more that goes on. We'll be talking about these final chapters next week. I believe this is the weekend or coming up this week where my co-hosts will be doing their videos for Children of Dune. So I would guess that I'd be echoing them by saying that it's around this time that we'll have to start saying, if you haven't read Children of Dune and you're worried about spoilers, about having the end of it spoiled for you, then you should either set aside an afternoon and finish it, or avoid these videos until you have, because there's no way that all of us are going to not talk about these things. I myself am going to talk all about the ending of this book next time, because not only because I loved it more rereading it this time than I've ever loved it before. Even those internal parts really affected me more this time than before, but also because the end of this book sets up the next one, and we're going to be moving straight on. My co-hosts get a rest until the third week in October, but we're going to be moving straight on to God Emperor. So we'll meet next week to finish up with Children of Dune. And until then, I'll wrap this up, but I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.